Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming or streaming this event. My name is Brian Gladden, and this is my little baby. So while we were all tucked away last year in our socially distant cocoons, I watched the news and the spin doctors on CNN and Fox and Facebook and Twitter and got angry and frustrated, depressed and disappointed in our nation, in our community, and in ourselves. To watch a march in Washington right before a swearing in, or a city in Seattle or Portland, burning, to watch panic and the absurdity of mass purchases of toilet paper and bottled water as we prepared for Ragnarok, to watch Congress and the Senate infight over who should be impeached next. This is ludicrous. But also, what can we do is what I thought. What can we do to head this off? It has to stop somewhere. We have to stop the fear and anger of the socioeconomic monsters that have been manifesting right before our eyes. No one in D.C. or the State House had time for me. They're active to put up games or party politics and making sure their re-election campaign survived. Yes. They were more concerned about Russian conspiracy, child porn scandal, and I mean, this has been Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire" condensed down to a Tide Pod concentrated in 2 years. But when I say that, I realize we as a country and as a community have been here before. We have been so lucky that if you think about it, our community really hasn't had a true enemy or a monster, if you will, that affects or scares us for at least the past 20 years or so. We have had good times. And so this scared the hell out of us because we forgot what an enemy was or what a monster was. So while reading one of my favorite authors and essayists and literary theorist, Umberto Eco, who's better known for his work, The Name of the Rose, he helped me get my thoughts together. The book and essays in which I speak is called Inventing the Enemy. I'm going to read a very short section, basically a paragraph, of where he was in Italy. He's a professor at Milan. He's deceased now. So when someone asks who was the greatest artist that died in the past 10 years, this would be mine. See what happened in the United States when the evil empire vanished and the great Soviet enemy faded away. The United States was in danger of losing its identity until bin Laden. In gratitude for the benefits received which he was fighting against the Soviet Union, Crow offered his merciful hand and gave Bush the opportunity to create a new enemy. That's one example. But more importantly, having an enemy is important. And so an enemy is a monster. I can identify the monster. I can face the monster. And either I will defeat it or it will defeat me. Having an enemy is important, not only to define our identity, but also to provide us with an obstacle against which to measure our system of values. In seeking to overcome it, to demonstrate our own worth. If you have time, find this book and read it. So, related to that, my other true hero is probably Joseph Campbell. He did a wonderful series called The Power of the Myth. His best known work is probably A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he is on a pedestal with Einstein or a philosopher. Part of the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell is identifying and recognizing our quest to know what we have to do within the hero's quest. We must identify and face our enemy, or in this case, our monster. Now, I'm referring to our monster in the social and socioeconomic sense, more so than the psychological sense, though they're very much interrelated. So please listen. Listen to the presenters. Listen to your peers and your friends, and also your enemies. There's a really good Norse saying: keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That's from the Book of Edda. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our Master of Ceremonies, Andre Whitmore. She is the head librarian at Ohio State Mansfield. And then Ms. Mary Cravenfield, she's the deputy director of the Mansfield Richmond County Public Library. So thank you for having me, and thank you for coming, guys. Please enjoy. And then if you have questions on Facebook Live, please ask them, and we'll get to those afterwards. And then please engage us when our presentation of this portion is done. There's a Q&A, so we'll go until we're done. Thank you.
Hey. So, as Brian said, my name is Mary Frankenfield. I work at the public library. I'm used to being in front of people, but usually I can play and I've memorized lines and I'm pretending that they're not there. This is a little more stressful. I'll do my best. You look like nice people, so I think I'll be okay. No monsters. No monsters. I just want to mention that this program is presented in partnership with NECIC, the Ohio State University at Mansfield, RCPG Arts and Culture Sector, and the Mansfield Richland County Public Library. Woo-hoo. And we very much thank the Playhouse for allowing us to use the theater tonight as well. I just want to start us off by introducing our panelists. And as I introduce them, they'll come up and do a short presentation. And when they're all done, we will get ready for the Q&A. All right, so first is Dr. Stephen Joyce. He's Associate Professor of German and Comparative Studies at the Ohio State University Mansfield campus. If you'd like to come up and begin.
As long as I'm here. First of all, thank you all for being here. This will be a fairly interesting symposium. What I'd like to do is make a few general remarks about monsters, and then talk a little bit about Freud, possibly in monsters. We're going to do a little bit of a stretch on that one. And then work that I've been working with, Homer's Odyssey. And talk a little bit about the monsters in the Odyssey and the function of monsters. So first of all, concept of monsters seems to be a universal staple of human imagination. So it's found in nearly all cultures and civilizations. On balance, I think we all agree they're fairly horrific, terrifying, and serious kind of entities. They take the form of ghosts, gods, hybrids. A lot of times they are composites between humans and animals, and sometimes versions of ourselves with exaggerated features and abilities. What have we done to monsters in the 21st century, in our own time? 3 things. Number 1, we've made them more graphic and more horrific than previously. And I append a little question, why? That'll be for later. Number 2, we've made them subject to the same ridiculous smallnesses that life presents to us, so that they appear funny and hapless and ridiculous. As if they were characters in a Seinfeld skit. And I'm thinking also, for example, Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein I saw again just a couple days ago. Or a new series called What We Do in the Shadows. So again, it'd be interesting to know why we are transforming monsters to make them appear this way. And then finally, I think we've defanged them. We've made them look cuddly, lovable, and all you have to do is Google kids' books and monsters, and you see an entire slew of books that depict monsters as something like a plush animal. And again, it's interesting. Why? Why are we doing that? So I have a little bit of familiarity with Sigmund Freud in literature at any rate, and working here, I would pose the question, what's the deal with monsters?
You want the slides?
If we could, yeah, we have the diagram of Freud's concept of human personality. Oh my gosh, it's huge. Kind of scary. Really. All right, I mean, there's a lot to say, obviously, about this model, but this is Freud's conception of the human personality. And if we take a close look, you can see we've got the ego, which he looks, actually, that's the very top of this iceberg. A little bit below that, what he would call the superego, and finally the unconscious. He chooses this to indicate that we are not the rational entities that we believe ourselves to be. And this was especially true when he was writing this at the turn of the century. The Viennese that looked at this concept, they were horrified by it. Here are these very cosmopolitan, sophisticated Viennese looking at Freud, and Freud is telling them, you are not really motored by anything rational. What you are motored by, and if you take a look on the side here, it says the id is part of the unconscious, is basically two instincts, eros and thanatos. Basically the life instinct and the death instinct. So this is what we are. And this whole area, Freud would say, this is an unruly, chaotic, dangerous place. But this is the source of our psychic energy. This is where we get our energy to do anything. So you have this little bit of ego on the top that has to negotiate. What he implies here is that we tend to be monsters motored by this very unruly erotic and fanatic instinct. That's unsettling for anybody. We would not want to believe that about ourselves. So he would say we are not, let's say, the creatures of the Enlightenment. We are not part of the legacy of the Enlightenment, but rather we are creatures struggling with these unconscious, dark, dangerous, erotic, and fanatic instincts. The expression that he uses to describe this whole thing, he says, we are a cauldron of seething excitations, which is kind of packs a punch. All right, so if you were here, I'd ask the question, where would you locate monsters in this diagram, this scheme? And I would say, you would probably say, well, they are inhabitants of this realm of the id, this very dark place in our personality where the life and death instinct kind of vie for fulfillment. That would be his first answer. The second answer would be that monsters are projections of our own dark, violent, and inscrutable selves. So again, these are some very difficult, and if you fancy these as truths, if you are adherents to that kind of idea, this is kind of a difficult thing to have to deal with. His student, Carl Jung, who eventually became a Swiss psychiatrist, developed two ideas that might explain a little bit more this universal fascination that we have with monsters. And those two concepts are the collective unconscious and archetypes. And what Jung does, this whole area that is the unconscious, he designates this. He says this is a universal, his notion of the collective conscious is a universal version of this personal unconscious. And this is also a really unsettling kind of idea, interesting idea. he asserts that all human beings hold certain mental patterns, memory traces, ideas, experiences of the human species as it developed and evolved. So in other words, it says we are hardwired with the memory of our evolution and development as a species. And that includes our primordial fears and anxieties. The recurring ideas, entities, and themes associated with that he calls archetypes. All right, so from here, we'll take maybe a leap back to the time of Homer, the 8th century BCE, and take a look at the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is filled with monsters. When Homer writes the Odyssey, roughly in the 8th century BCE, what he does, he draws upon this repository of tales and stories that were actually handed down from the Greek Mycenaean age of roughly 1300 BCE. These tales and stories featured a number of monsters. On balance, what Homer does, he divides his monsters into male monsters and female monsters, with some exceptions. Is it possible to project the list? I won't go through all of them, but what I have in red, these are the female monsters. And this is interesting because there are many more female monsters in the Odyssey than there are male monsters. Homer's Odyssey, when he's writing this, he makes these monsters appear as obstacles. And obstacles in the way of Odysseus trying to reestablish his kingship, trying to get back to the island of Ithaca, and once again becoming the Lord of Ithaca. Homer's monsters in this regard are serviceable in a literary sense because what they do, they force him to consider two very important points that really resonate with us in modern times. The first one is the question of identity. As Odysseus makes his way through the Mediterranean for these 10 years, he begins to doubt who he is and what it is that he does. Maybe more important is the question of character. Not only who you are, but what kind of person you are, and how does that affect your quote-unquote life journey. So of these 10 obstacles, and maybe cut to the chase on this, Freud would say this. They combine the two id-forces of Eros and Thanatos. And this makes the female monsters in the Odyssey very formidable. Odysseus finds the female monsters to be far more dangerous, far more difficult to overcome than the male monsters. I don't know if you can project the image of Odysseus blinding the Centaurs of Phoenix. That's scary too. But this is what Odysseus does well, because he is primarily a warrior. He prides himself on being very sly. He is the one that comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse that defeats the Greeks. But it is much easier for him to put out the eye of Cyclops than to deal with the likes of Circe or Calypso. And if you maybe forward those images, just to give you an idea. This is actually top from the base that shows Odysseus trying to deal with the sirens. And I mean, it's interesting because he doesn't have the actual wherewithal to do it himself, so he has to be bound. And yet he's interested. So when you take a look at the sirens, they are certainly the embodiment of both id and rather Eros and Thanatos. And it is something that really troubles Odysseus as he goes through the Mediterranean. So, quickly coming to the end here. Of the 10 years that Odysseus finds himself wandering through the Mediterranean, he spends 7 of these years with the nymph Calypso. And I think there's also an image of this. This is Circe, the witch. I think there's one more. So one And this is actually a very interesting depiction. Maybe one more, but a more interesting depiction. This is, here's Odysseus with Calypso. It kind of gives an indication, or at least this is an artist's understanding of what Odysseus does all day. What is interesting is every night Odysseus goes to the sea and he weeps because he wants to return to Penelope. And the more you read this section about him going to the beach to weep, after spending most of the day doing this, you begin to wonder about the sincerity of those tears. But it is interesting because there's this patriarchal thing going on certainly in the Odyssey. In some sense, Homer is being apologetic for his behavior and saying, not his fault, it's not his fault, it's her fault. All right, so finally, female monsters Odysseus encounters, they comprise the ultimate erotic, fanatic, dark monsters that bring him to his knees, revealing his fears, vulnerabilities, and the limits of both his understanding and power. So it is the painful truth that Odysseus comes to see that he is a kind of original Jekyll and Hyde. He is both monster and man, and warrior and slave. So while he eventually does reclaim, let's say, being Lord of Ithaca, it is far more doubtful whether he does that to himself. Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Dawn Kitchen, who requested to go first, which is not Dr. Kitchen is a professor at OSU in Mansfield. She serves as the associate dean on the Mansfield campus, and I feel that her area of study probably helps her in that position. With the students.
I studied versus monkeys and staff and everyone, yes. Unruly monkeys. Somebody with them timing, so we'll just start waiting. Put timer on. Unlike Dr. Joyce, hold on. I don't have a timer. Oh, I'm just gonna, hold on, timer, I have a timer. Sorry, otherwise we'll be here all day. We don't want that. Stopwatch starts. Unlike Dr. Joyce, who just gave us something that's clearly should be published, that's not the approach I took. Brian said, this is going to be a casual Q&A, give a few minutes. And then he said, how's 2 minutes sound? And then I, like an idiot, said, no, we need at least 5 to 7 minutes, because I can't say hello, I'm Dawn Kitchen, in 2 minutes. But I didn't know we were going to write theses, so I had nothing to say in that regard. But we're still at the same OSU, I promise. My monster currently is that I'm the dean and associate dean, and so it takes all my time. So I did not write a little speech. But if I could have a slide, I have no idea what these slides are. I literally made them a little while ago. But I want to tell you, I have a title slide though. I think I have a title slide. Sorry, I'm going to probably do this because there's like 38 slides to go through in 6 minutes, so I'll probably do like this. Is that okay? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure we got it.
I know, I shouldn't have, anyway.
Let's do without slides.
Let's do it without slides.
Yeah.
Do you have slides?
I don't think we have your
Never got the email.
I did email you, but
But
you know my internet was not working. I'm going to pantomime all the slides. It's going to be even more fun.
Interpret things.
Yes, I had a title though, and I can't remember what it was. Because he said to me, Brian said to me, can you do this thing? He told me this months ago, and I'm like, no, I don't have time, I don't have time, I don't have time. And he said, yes, you do. It's going to be very informal. So I said, okay. So it's monsters. So he said, speak about what monsters you're passionate about. Well, I'm like, so first of all, let me say, I'm Dawn Kitchen. I'm an anthropologist. And if you don't know what anthropology is, it's the study of humans. And I know you think, well, that's sociology and psychology and biology, yes, but somehow we made it different because we brought all of those together in a weird, crazy field that brings it all together. But I don't really do the cultural side of things, although I have some experience in it. I do the biological side of things, which is I'm looking at the evolution of humans and why we are the way we are. Cultural is so, this is why it's so weird. Culture, biology is biology. Cultural stuff is all learned, which isn't necessarily biology, although it predisposes us to culture, right? So I'm like, does he want me to do culture? And so then I'm like thinking about the things, nothing at the level that Dr. Joyce was just speaking about. I don't work quite there, but I was thinking about like what different cultures think about monsters and why do we have monsters? And I started thinking about xenophobia and dragons and, here be dragons, don't go here because this is where the other, right? Xenophobia means the fear of the other, right? And probably there's an evolutionary background to the fear of the other. Back when we were nomadic, if we were living in our little group and that looked like a different group, we go over there, they're going to steal our girls, they're going to steal our food, they're going to give us diseases. We should be afraid of them, right? That was adaptive. And so probably we said there's scary dragons here, which of course is a hybrid of all the things monkeys, our other ancestors, are afraid of. Cats and raptors and snakes, right? So scary, don't go here, scary people, scary things, right? And so xenophobia is probably adaptive. But the thing about adaptations is we have a big brain and we can get around that now, right? So we shouldn't be afraid of the other anymore, but somehow we are. But I think that others are going to sort of discuss that. So I'm going to leave the cultural side of things, although I'm always bringing evolution in, and go back to the evolution. That's what I decided to think about. And he said, what are you passionate about? Like I said, I'm passionate about zombie movies, which it's like, he doesn't want to hear me talk about zombie movies. Although we could have talked about like our instinctive fear of decomposing things, which is good, or the neurobiology, but none of that worked. So then I thought, what am I passionate about? And then I thought, the other scary movies that I watch are always scary movies, like, at 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe I do think about ghosts and zombies if I'm alone, but mostly what you're afraid of is some big dude is going to break into the house and chase you with an axe, right? Aggressive men. And we just talked about aggressive, scary monster females, so I think it's okay that I go this way. What I study in biological anthropology is the evolution of male aggression and competition. That's what I study. So that's what I'm passionate about. And then I think, how does that deal with monsters? Well, when we think about humans, when we think about what are we, we're monstrous in the ways we think about things like xenophobia, like racism. But we're also monstrous in our behavior towards others. I started looking up some stats. The number of aggression against, my husband's a social worker, so I don't even want to talk about the aggression against children because he doesn't like to tell me because I can't even imagine it, right? Aggression against dogs and pets and things. But the domestic violence, something like 20 people every minute or something there's domestic violence against. The number of rapes, the number of homicides. Aggression is a big deal, and that's our monster in some ways, and that's the monster movies that I like to watch. So I thought, well, I can bring it back to monkeys because that's really what I know. So that's where we were. So that's my journey to here, which now my talk is about. I was going to have all these great pictures of, and maybe it's best I don't show them. So I study baboons. The reason we study monkeys, if we're looking at humans, why do we study monkeys, right? Well, I'm interested in behavior. Fossils don't tell us much about behavior, right? They do a little bit, but not much. So if I want to know about where our behaviors came from, if I look at fossils of Lucy and Neanderthals, I can learn a little bit. But the best idea is to look at our closest living relatives and go, okay, if they do it and we do it, the most parsimonious answer is back in our evolutionary, before we diverged, that ancestor did it, right? Or if we do it and they don't do it, maybe it occurred on our line, and that's why I study living relatives instead of fossils. But if you think about humans and our monstrous trait of violence and aggression, it does date back. So there's some cool fossil evidence, just to give some kudos to my other anthropology friends who study fossils. Recently in Spain, they found a 430,000-year-old skull of a Neanderthal, which some would argue is human, and some would, that's a whole debate that's out there. But anyway, Neanderthals are at least close non-living relatives that died out. And the skull shows it's a perfect skull with clear, like if you're a forensic anthropologist or a biologist or whatever, landed in Mansfield, you would clearly go, somebody beat this person to death with a club, right? And 430,000 years ago, we can see that clear evidence that somebody beat this person with a club. This person didn't just bump his head and die. He was beat with a club multiple times. And there's other indications of Neanderthal violence on violence, right? In fact, the only humans that bodies, when you look at them forensically, that look like Neanderthals are circus rodeo clowns. Anyway, just an aside. But all of the evidence we have in the fossils has been about individual violence. One individual is dead. Recently, in East Africa, near Lake Turkana, which is famous if you're interested in anthropology and fossils, it's a big place to find stuff. They found evidence of an entire group of people, 27 individuals, that were bludgeoned to death. They were clearly in a war, a battle at least, right? And at least 4 of them, there's no wearing on the bones, but by their posture were clearly bound. Not only were there evidence that they were bludgeoned, that they were hit with spears, 2 of the individuals had shards of the spears still stuck inside of them. Like, this is warfare, right? So whatever we do, we can blame it on Trump, or blame it on Biden, easily, but we could blame it on all these things, right? But it isn't new. This isn't new. We're dealing with it. Okay, so it's not our fault, right? It's our evolution. Well, of course, we have a giant brain. We have a giant brain to deal with xenophobia. It isn't adaptive anymore. A lot of things we do that probably evolved, because I was telling some people at dinner, we have instinct to kind of eat salt because we lived many years ago far from oceans eating plants. But if we eat salt all the time, we're going to get heart attacks and die with salt everywhere now, right? So we have a big brain to deal with that, and we're supposed to, and I'm not sure I do. So anyway, so what about this warfare? Where does it come from, and why don't we deal with it? I don't know about the why don't we deal with it. I'm going to leave to the psychologists, right? But getting back to this notion of where did it come from, does it go back further? Can we blame? So I had some cool videos, which maybe aren't so cool, of the baboons that I studied being aggressive. Being aggressive because they captured prey, being aggressive, males fighting males, being aggressive, males beating up females for sex. That happens a lot in baboons. Being aggressive with other groups, and then being aggressive, so aggressive that a new male comes in and he kills the babies of the last male, infanticide, and this is of course adaptive because then the female will come into cycling and he'll make babies. Doesn't make it right, but that's what happens. So I was going to show you all those cool videos, but maybe it's kind of gory, so it's good. But when we think about humans, so when I say we look at our closest living relatives, we diverged from baboons something like, oh gosh, I hope I don't get this wrong, about 25 million years ago. That's a long time, right? So maybe we can't look at Neanderthals and Lucy to find out because we fossilized, but could we get a little closer to humans? So my colleagues study chimpanzees. Some of them study, when I went to grad school, I worked with the Jane Goodall project, so they study them in Tanzania. I was studying other silly monkeys. I didn't study the chimps, but my friends do, and I had great pictures from my friends. Chimps are our closest living relatives. This is not debatable. We share 97 to 98, depending on the test you run, of their DNA. So meaning you can take many genes that make hemoglobin, which keeps your oxygen going, and take it from a chimp, put it in you, and you'll be fine. Right? To give you an example, we all, though, share 99.9% of our DNA. It's only 0.1% gives us the little differences that we have. So there's a lot there, but we and chimps are both share only, we're different by 1 point, I'm sorry about the number, something like 2% with gorillas. So when you go to the zoo and you see a chimp, and then you see a gorilla and you go, yeah, I get they're related. That chimp is way more related to you than he is to, or she is to the gorilla. Okay, so just so you know. So this is this great, but are we similar? Sure enough, they're not that different in body size. They're about the same size as a human female on average, small human female. And they live in communities, like little tiny small towns, and then they break into these fission fusion groups. So one day they're out in this little party, and one day they're out in this little party. And if one of the females is an estrus, there's a lot more males in that group. I mean, I have an 18 or 17-year-old in high school, let's be honest. This is what we live in, right? So this is their communities. So let's look at what they do, and are they at all similar to us? So Jane Goodall shows up there, 55 years ago, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika or whatever it is in Tanzania, and she sees these great chimps, and she puts out bananas, and everything's hippie fun, and isn't this cool, and we're meeting our closest living relatives, and then one day some things start going down, and she starts to realize. So they live in societies where the males stay in the group that they were born with, and they bond with their relatives. They've got their cousins and their brothers, and their dads and their godfathers, and you can imagine a whole Italian reference here to mafia kind of thing. They don't have to bond anymore, but they bond. Females leave the group that they're born in and make their way out. And then the resources are scarce, and females need more resources. They make babies, they have to lactate, they need to stay, there's not enough resources, they stay away from everybody trying to make their baby live, right? So they can eat enough to make milk to make this baby. So they don't have any friends in this group. And the males are in this like mafioso sort of situation. And the males are they're 25% bigger, right? And males are super aggressive. They beat up each other. They do this whole political jockeying thing. They beat up females. There's sexual assault. Is it rape? I'm not quite sure. I don't know. This isn't my field of study, but it's ugly. They commit infanticide where they kill somebody else's baby so the female will come into estrus. They've even cannibalized some of that. And then they do things that shocked Jane completely. In about, let me get this wrong, so let's not put it totally on the internet, but about 1974, the community called Casacala, which is the one she studied, they had about, I think it was like 7 males. They go on these patrols where they go from loud, they're like Dawn Kitchens of the primate world. They're loud all the time. And then they suddenly shut up and go on these sneaky patrols into the territory of the other group. And they systematically, from I think it's 1974 to 1978, snuck into the other territory, would find single males from that group that were off on their own, and attack them and kill them with their bare hands, until they killed every single male in the other community. This is warfare. They literally, over the course of 3 or 4 years, killed all the other males, took the female, they did kill one female too, but they took the females, took the territory. And these are our closest living relatives. So now we go, well, it's not our fault. They have pretty big brains, right? Everybody's committing warfare. So fine, so monsters are here, and there are genetic heritage, right? Aha, but wait. There's another, there's different populations of chimps, and they've been separated, and blah, blah, blah. You all know how evolution, right? Separation, they've been separated for a long time. Things happen either randomly or by adaptation, and species separate. And it takes a really long time, and that's why we never see it. Well, what we didn't know is there's one thing that to the naked eye looks a little like a chimp. Although if you took all of them and measured them, they're all slightly smaller. They have, I don't know why, weirdly parted in the middle hair. Like it's like my kid, I'm like, just hand that over, butt straight right here. They tend to have darker hair, wispier hair, they're smaller. They have a little less sexual dimorphism, so the females, but they're pretty still, the males are pretty big. And they have, when they're born, black faces, whereas chimps have light faces, but their faces get darker. And they tend to walk upright more. Okay, but if you look at their genetic DNA, they separated from chimps 1.5 million years ago. Meaning that if you look at an evolutionary tree, they're up here, bonobos and chimps, come down here, and then there's here, and there's a whole bunch of Australopithecines and Neanderthals that died out, but we're here. We share a common ancestor with both those groups, both of them. They're equally related to us, even though they diverge. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm sorry to get my elbow over it. This is my pantomime. You see my evolutionary tree? So we share a relative with both of them. They diverged later. But okay, so great. And you know what? They still have males that are bigger. Males live in groups with their relatives, their cousins and their dads and their granddads. Females leave. And they live in these communities that are fission fusion. But you know what? They don't commit infanticide. They don't sexually assault females. They don't commit warfare on other groups. And in fact, okay, there's my drum roll. The females dominate the males. This is huge. Even if you're a feminist and you're like, well, there are societies where females have, no, there are not. There are societies where females have fairly equitable relationships with males, but there are no Amazon, I'm sorry, dig up the do archaeology studies, there are no Amazon communities. But this is an ape where the females dominate the males. And you know why it happens? Turns out probably it's because there's more resources, the females don't have to spread out. You know, like they were making babies and lactating, they were spread out. They come together, there's enough food to go around, so they sit and eat together. And they're also sexually motivated. They are the hippies of the ape. They are the make love, not war. And everybody has sex. all the time. Like when they're mad, when they're happy, when they've been gone, if they're new, if they're old, if they're boys and boys, if they're girls and girls. In fact, we think that it's called GG rubbings, that these females take part in all the time, and it helps them bond. And sex is fabulous. And these females bond, and when the males get aggressive, sure, one male is 25% bigger than the female, but he's not bigger than two females. And even though these females aren't related, which doesn't happen in the monkey kingdom, we see females bonding, they're typically related. These guys are bonded through sex. And everybody's mostly happy, and mostly things go well. Well, what in the hell are we supposed to think about ourselves, right? Where do we come from? Which one of these is more like their, what is their parsimony, what is the parsimonious answer here? What is their shared? Probably, we have a little of both. And in fact, we now have done, I'm characterizing this, there's a lot more research recently, and we now know that if you put chimps in captivity where there's lots of, it's utopian, they've got all the food they want, the females can bond. The females sometimes gang together and stand up to males. And males tend to be peaceful in those situations. So sometimes the male chimps and the female chimps can get along in a more peaceful society. And the bonobos have been not very well studied. They're in the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire. They're hard to get to. We didn't even realize they were separate species. So we don't know a lot about it, but more and more studies have come out that there is some violence. So there is some aggression. It's often female against male violence. Males often have not all their fingers, and some of them don't have their penis. So I guess you don't want to piss off a bonobo female or her friends. But anyway, so, basically what I think is happening is there's the duality, right? We have the duality. And in my slideshow there was going to be a reference back to dragons, which I think I was going to do at the beginning, and Daenerys Targaryen, and I don't want to give away anything, but she's fighting demons and angels, and the demons win, right? Because we can't always fight both. But I think that's, to me, our monsters do have an evolutionary basis, but it doesn't give us any excuses, right? And but it does help you remember that when you shouted at somebody, maybe that's your demon, but you need to bring your angel back and, deal with that, hopefully. Anyway, that's where I was going.
Thank you, Dr. Kitchen. Okay, next, we will be hearing from Dr. Phil Pizzacco. Dr. Pizzacco is Associate Professor of Psychology at Fieldhouse in Mansfield.
Hi, everyone. So I have slides for the whole thing. Okay, yeah, so title Talk Racism in America When the Monsters Are Real, and we can go right to the second slide. So I'm starting off with two quotes here, sort of ancient quotes. Words and actions are transient things, and being one's past are nothing, but the effect of them on the moral soul being endless. Then Isaac Newton, the third law of motion, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. The basic idea here applies to morality is that when you commit an act that is immoral or evil, it is not just the victim that suffers consequences, it is the perpetrator as well. That's kind of the main thesis of this law. Anyone know They Might Be Giants, the band?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they had a song in 1990, Your Racist Friend, has a line in it, you can't shake hands with the devil and say, I won't kid him. And it's kind of a more succinct, clever way of paraphrasing these quotes. There are consequences to immorality and to evil actions. So next slide, please. So again, that's the basic thesis here, is that when we're talking about racism, of course, there are victims, and it is reasonable and right to focus on the victims and their suffering. But I think it's also useful to focus on the perpetrators, not just in terms of understanding the psychology of evil, but also the implications of evil actions for the perpetrators. So again, if you think of racism as a kind of monster, the perpetrators then are the monsters, and one of the sort of general characteristics of any monster is there's some either spiritual lacking or a soullessness, and so committing an act of racism should create some sort of spiritual weakness or soul sickness. So certainly you can look throughout imagination and myth and fiction and find many examples of monsters that are very disturbing, frightening, and in some cases they represent some force that exists within society, some individual who is evil, who has been sort of caricatured as a monster. But you don't need to look to fiction or imagination or myth. You can find monsters just living amongst us throughout humanity. So what I have, you can put up the next picture, is a series of, or the next slide, a series of pictures. There's a fictional monster and then what I would call a real monster engaged in some sort of race-related action or expression. So on right over here we have sort of a classic ghoul. One of the things to notice about this individual, who looks like they've probably been feasting on brains, I would say.
For sure.
The eyes are white. So usually when we try to identify the seat of humanity within a fellow human, we look to the eyes and the pupils, and we'll appeal to the eyes of another person for mercy or for compassion. And part of the point of the depiction of pupils is there's no way to appeal to humanity. It's just a blank slate. This individual on your left, what's left out of the picture, he's at a lynching and there's a body hanging from a tree, and he's pointing to the body. And although this individual has irises and pupils, I would suggest if you're looking for humanity in those eyes at this moment, you're not going to find it. Which of these monsters is more disturbing? To me, it's very clear the one on the left is far more disturbing, but also entirely real. Next slide, please. Here on your left, you have the sisters from The Shining, Stanley Kubrick film. And this is a common sort of trope in stories and movies. You have the corrupted innocence of youth, Children of the Corn, The Ring, The Exorcist. There's 1,000 movies that have malevolent children in them. And again, it's especially disturbing because we think of children as innocent and angelic. Over here on the right, it's another lynching. In this case, you actually see part of the body here, but you have a child who looks so angelic, who's smiling. And if you took them out of the picture, you might imagine they were at a fair. It was, I don't know, a Easter or something like that. But no, she's at a lynching and she's beaming with pride. Again, where's the real monster here? Which one is more disturbing? I think, again, clearly the real monster on the right. Next slide, please. Here on your right, you have sort of maybe a post-apocalyptic military-style ghoul. And on the left, you have an individual from some sort of white pride, alt-right, whatever it is, movements in their little uniform get-up thing. And but once again, if you look in the eyes of the monster on your right, it's just light. There is a lack of humanity here, a lack of compassion, empathy, and so on. Once again, this individual has eyes and pupils, but you would struggle to find humanity in this moment. This person has come under the spell of an ideology, and that ideology has transformed them into a monster in this moment. Next slide. Here on your right, you have zombies, which George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, I think it was 1968 was when that movie came out. And zombies crave brains. So maybe that's sort of metaphorically saying they're trying to eat your humanity. And here on your left, you have the 1960 lunch counter protests in Greensboro, North Carolina, where you have some protesters just sitting at a lunch counter, and a crowd of individuals behind them pouring drinks and food items on the heads of these people, shouting horrible things and death threats. Again, trying to steal the humanity of these individuals. I would even theorize that maybe the reason that Night of the Living Dead came out in the late 60s was this was the monster for the times. The monster is not a Dracula or a werewolf. It's society. We are the monsters. And we are under the spell of this racist ideology. Again, it's more palatable, I think, to think about zombies who just want our brains. Another point you can make is that the zombies are not winning. They're living a life in hell or an unlife in hell. And it's not clear that these people in the background here at the lunch counters are winning anything. They're sort of trading in their souls for this moment of power over these individuals sitting in this protest. Next slide, please. Here on your left, you have your sort of run-of-the-mill bloody ghoul, graphic ghoul. And then on the right, this is an image that may be familiar from a couple years ago, one of these alt-right Proud Boys, whatever it was protest, the Tiki Torch protest. And this particular individual kind of became iconic and represented all of the other people. But it's this just a person who has been taken by rage, again, based on an ideology. And as disturbing as this image on the left is, the one on the right is just exponentially more disturbing to me because that's a real person who represents a population of individuals who share this very fearful, ignorant, hateful ideology. Next. Here on the left, you have just your classic ghost, a hood, and on the right, you have KKK members in their little uniforms. And I mean, here, the analogy just couldn't be more clear. We're literally just dressing up like monsters and doing monstrous things. And obviously, part of the purpose of those uniforms is to spread fear and intimidation. Okay, so next slide. So, I think it's not rocket science to suggest that monsters are caricatures of humans and human characteristics, the sort of, I guess, darker side of humanity, some of the things that you see on the list there, racism, xenophobia certainly would be included on that list. And I think part of the appeal of monster movies and stories is that they allow us to confront some of these human characteristics in a way that is sort of safe because it's an unreality. We know that vampires aren't real. We know that zombies aren't real. We know that werewolves aren't real. On the other hand, we know the Holocaust happened. That actually happened. Racism was a 400-year ongoing crime that's still happening. It's hard to confront those realities. It's much easier to confront zombies and ghouls and ghosts. And then I think I have one more slide. So here's a quote from Thomas Aquinas to end this up. Sin is a spiritual illness, sinners are in need of salvation. So again, typically when we think about racism, we think about the victims, we think about reparations, and healing the victims, and making them whole again, and restoring their dignity and their humanity, and that's as it should be. But I think that we cannot truly move past racism unless we also consider the harms that the ideology of racism has conferred upon perpetrators as well. It's as if an exorcism is needed to exorcise the demons that have infested individuals who have perpetrated racist acts for hundreds of years. And that's not the most satisfying conclusion, that we need to really have a little compassion for the racists and the people who have committed lynchings and hate crimes and heal them as well. But they are us. I mean, they are humans and they have been taken under this spell. And I think that before we can truly move on, which may not happen for 100 years, we will need to exorcise those individuals who have been taken under this spell and infested with these demons, so to speak. That's it.
Great. Next up, we have Mr. Brent Billingsley. He is an artist and an empowering voice behind young disenfranchised youth. He's also a behavioral health specialist at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center of Psychiatry. And he's making his way. Thank you.
All right. How's everybody doing? Good. Awesome. Sucks. So, it's good to be here, first of all. Thank you, Regism. Grand Pride, y'all know about that. Hold it down here. So when I thought about monsters, from my perspective, and dig into that, my profession. So I went to work, and we had these group monster sessions with the population that I serve. Because I felt like they deserved a voice. So I made a choice. See, I work in adolescent psychiatry, and oftentimes I use methods of dialectical behavior therapy to reach what at times seems completely unreachable. And to teach what can often be considered unteachable circumstances. I mean, the chances of high acuity, bad behavior, ambivalence, psychosis, suicidal, and homicidal ideations. Not adaptive thinking. Consistent recidivism. Listen. The kids decided to see that I would convey what they thought to you all poetically. Keep up. Like the softest of knock or the softest of walk on a hardwood floor, and a most frightening gentle knock on a little girl's door at 3 hours past midnight. Or yet another fight, and his household remains firmly divided. And yes, he provided life, and for that you should be grateful, but that gives them no cause to beat you. Or that you have to raise your siblings, because oftentimes you're the only ones there. And I dare you go to that school and say something about what happens in this house to a teacher. And that preacher, he better mind his business too. See, in the movies, the heroine slew the monster, and all was well. But in another tale, heroine created the monster, as evidenced by disfigurement, fits of rage and anger, complete lack of empathy and blood-sucking tendencies, or that a coward will have the audacity to put his hands on a woman because he thinks he can, while the children stand there helpless, bearing witness to such atrocities. You know, one kid group specifically was asked about monsters. And the only answer he could give was, Mr. B, I'm not afraid of any fake monsters in movies, because there were real monsters where I live. All right, that's the poem section for y'all. Hope y'all, I let you go here. So, I'm old, right? So I don't do slides without the, devil's make the computer. That's why I'm sorry. So, so I do a lot of poetic deliverances, and that was something that me and my kids created. So actually, I went to work. I said, all right. I said, look, I was speaking at the symposium. I'm going back to the field, man. So, Mr. Where's that at? It's close to where the bar is from. Don't worry about it. It's close to where the bar is from. So, I need y'all to help me deliver this talk as far as what we're going to talk about. And I said, okay, so monsters, go. I don't know, you can't do one, shut up. Monsters, go. And because of where I work at, because I'm in adolescent psychiatry, and the things that I see on a consistent basis are made-for-TV movies. And I've seen some things that all you can do is go home and pray and hope that it doesn't happen to your children. And it gets very, very deep, it gets very, very real. You have to be very mindful that you are professional and not too connected. Because when somebody comes in that reminds you of your story, then look out, because it'll be heavy. So we in group, we speak, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, the kids, they're supposed to shut up when I'm talking. I love talking to my kids crazy. And Mr. B, you're so crazy, that's what Mr. B. So we did a series of drawings, and I thought it was interesting because this is what I'll do. I'll give my kids a topic, and I'll say, like, especially when we do poetry, and when we do spoken word sessions, those are like my deepest roots. That's why I came out with the poem at first. And it was a poem from the beginning. catch up preachers? Of course you did. So, and it'll be my people because I say, okay, the word is why. And I know I'm picking on preachers because I can. Because he's gonna forgive me. That's what I know. You know what I know for sure in this house that's gonna forgive me. So I'm messing with him for the rest of the night. So, all right. If you don't, then I might show up in church and talk about it. Oh, you don't forgive everybody. So I give him a copy. Why? I tell everybody right. And it's intriguing to see the different cultural aspects, the different gender aspects. You take the word why, and it will go so deep and so heavy with these kids who are what I call what we do crisis stabilization. So, you know, parents come in and sometimes you see why the kids are there. So, and they're like, well, you ain't fix them. I said, well, ma'am, I'm sorry. We can't fix them. All we can do is stabilize the crisis and give them some coping skills that can use, hopefully they can utilize. That's when all the work starts. But, you know, we can help. But you give them that word and they go with it. And it's amazing to these groups. And I've seen more drainage of emotions in these groups than anything else because you allow a child to expose themselves. You know, and when you are self-reflective on why you're there, when you are all the way admitting, okay, I'm here because of this, and then you can share it. There is a power that comes in exposing what you know to be wrong for you. And when you put that to the atmosphere, that's I'm old school Christian dude, so I think business is the best medicine. Look at it that way. But I feel like when you expose things that are hindering you put them out there, that's healing also. So my kids came up with some different monsters. So, you know, we got some Pennywise up in here. So, you know, this is all the same group, right? So we got Pennywise coming through. I got them laminated. I think, you know, I'm all about, you know, I'm a big hug, you know, Coke about killing me because I'm a big, come here, give me some sugar. I'm that dude. I'm hugging, you know. I'm like, oh, come on, baby girl. So I got this half skull, half face. And I always have stories behind them, right? Every time I do a group with a kid, you know, I had this girl that says, I think monsters are misunderstood. And she's having like, that's fantastic. Put some more color on that for me, baby. Good. This was pretty deep, right? So I had a child that was like praying, and then you had some things happening here with some suicide stuff. And, you know, so where I work at, oftentimes somebody working with like, oh, don't draw that stuff. And I'm like, and I'm an artist, so I'm really, you know, I'm sensitive about art. I'm like, why can't they draw it? Because if this is how they feel and they're expressing themselves, maybe you should listen to what they're conveying to you artistically instead of telling them that's not appropriate. Because maybe they need to have a conversation. So I'm going to get all in my feelings. So, this girl had one. She said, but Mr. B, all I can draw is stick figures. The baby jumped out. She did stick figures. And she wrote a poem, and it's My Dad's a Monster. Right? You gaslight me for fun, and it seems like you're always on the run. You never act like you care, and I'm done because it isn't fair. And I get this consistent when we do certain things. I love this one. So this one was a child who felt like they were being left alone. I was like, wow, look at that. And it's like, and you can feel that. You can feel, and I like this kid because this kid has, again, Farsight's coming at, he has what it's called as confident mark making. Like they can just go. They don't do like this. They just kind of go and they flow and they're very confident, which means they're artistic, which means they're confident in what they're doing. So that can translate to other things if you can do that. Some kids can, some kids can't. As one kid had this is my homeboy too. He had some guns in the skull. And I was like, all right, bro, you know. But that's his thing, that's his MO, that's what he does. But then you have to talk about, okay, so where's this kid from? What neighborhood is he from, right? You know, why do some kids gravitate to certain things? Why are some kids more violent? I deal with kids all the time in the city, and I'll be out there, and I paint murals a lot. And one of my biggest problems where I paint murals at Cincinnati is they have this big agenda of making certain neighborhoods beautiful, and they love to go out and put paint on walls, and then they leave. So you make these connections. You do this stuff, and you engage this community, and after the paint is dry, everybody's gone. And I have a problem with that. So I try to, make a presence known, start an initiative, start some classes, do something to let them know. Because I've been mentoring now for 20-some years, and one of the most important things you can do in a child's life is be present, is be available. And when you show up and then you leave, you're just like everybody else. And now they're back to not trusting anybody. This one was probably the deepest one that the kid drew. And it showed the black eye on the female. Wow. That's it, and they're always watching what we do. They're always observing. And we have to be very mindful. I was at work last week, and we were having a session actually, and a coworker had some bad news, and they started crying on me. I told her, I said, hey, do me a favor, tell her to excuse herself immediately, because where we work at, it's not the time for that. You got to be like, those kids cannot tell nothing was happening to you in your life personally. Because when it's time to work on my milieu in my hospital in psychiatry, you gotta be like MJ and just let everything be able to play. You can't be like, not going to go to practice. I said, look at our it's all good. You got to be brave, you have to be prepared. Because I often tell people, well, when did you start your shift? Meaning when I start my shift, I said, see, that's a problem. Because in this field, you better start your shift in your car ride to work and whatever you need to listen to, because we got to start dealing with these kids' monsters. And their monsters is deep, and it's heavy, and it's weighty. And we have to be prepared as clinicians to be able to say, okay, whatever monsters you got, I'm here to help you slay them. All right, that's my time.
All right, thank you.
Cool.
All right. So last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Pastor Aaron Williams, Jr. Pastor Williams has served as pastor of the Maddox Memorial Church of God in Christ in Mansfield, Ohio for the past 5 years. He has formerly served in ministry for 18 years. He also works for the Mansfield School District and serves as a mentor for youth in the community. So Pastor, would you like to come on up? And all I can say is, it might be your turn now.
I got big shoulders.
Wow. This has been amazing this evening.
Yeah.
And a big shout out to Ryan and Gladden for this opportunity. Brave gentlemen, because this is a serious topic, and as I was going through and wondering what are we going to talk about this evening, myself, certainly all of, not all, but some of the topics that were touched on this evening have crossed my mind. Racism, first of all. But certainly when Brian asked me about this and talked to me about it and tried to share his vision as far as what monsters to deal with. Something he said to me was either real or perceived monsters. And certainly the monsters that have been presented this evening have been real in a lot of people's minds and their hearts. Real in our faces. Some we have seen on social media, on the media, in the media. And some people deal with their monsters individually. Many other folks may not ever see or witness the monsters that some people are dealing with. And I think Mr. Billingsley spoke about that rather eloquently. And so I would like to share with you a monster that hopefully kind of sums up everything. And trust me, please know, I had no idea I was going to be last. And I'm daunted by all of these learned individuals who have come ahead of me. I'm honored. I'm grateful. Dr. Joyce spoke on the Odyssey, dealing with those several monsters. I didn't really realize that they were broken up in male and female. How they all had their different, I knew they were male and female, but I didn't realize just how they were broken up like that. It was brought that to life, and how they all had their own way of tormenting an individual. Dr. Joyce, Dr. Kitchen talked about evolution of aggression, which is a monster, can be a monster if unchecked. She spoke about us having big brains. We should be able to handle our aggression. I work in the school systems, as mentioned, and a lot of the kids say, I have anger issues. I got anger issues too. You do? You do? Yes, but I have to keep my anger in check. Otherwise, some things might happen that I will feel bad about later on. Okay? So, we have to keep our anger in check. And then Dr. Mazzocco spoke about the monster of racism. A racist being a monster. That can be a daunting thing for different segments of people. You know, scary thing. Mr. Billingsley came with the poetic domestic violence. Never heard domestic violence that poetic. Although entertaining, it is very frightening. Very frightening. But I would like to submit to you today the monster of ignorance. If I may. Monster of ignorance. First of all, let me share with you the definition of monster that I have. Grotesquely deviates from normal shape, behavior, or character. Excites, or incites, I should say, horror by wickedness and cruelty. Ignorance. Ignorance, let's look at ignorance. Simply the state of not knowing, for the purpose of what we're speaking about this evening. Simply the state of not knowing. The lack of knowledge or information. State of not knowing. You don't know. I was ignorant to that fact. I was ignorant to the purposes of the different monsters in the Odyssey. I was like going to say the Iliad, or Iliad. The Iliad, yeah, the Odyssey. Okay, so, ignorance, I want to submit to you that ignorance actually breeds fear. Ignorance breeds fear. And I'm going to get to you we tend to fear what we do not understand, what we don't know about. We don't understand it, or if it's different to us, we tend to draw back from it. I think it takes a lot of courage for someone to go into a foreign country, into their jungle, and look and study a creature that kind of looks like us, but doesn't speak our language. They're a little more hairy than we are. And then at times they go out and hunt other ones that look like them and kill them with their bare hands. It takes courage. Because personally, I don't know anything about it. I'm ignorant to it. And so I'm afraid of that. I'm not going looking out for no chimpanzees. And a few years ago, I heard in the news where this lady had a pet chimpanzee and it ate her face. You know, I'll get a goldfish. Right? So ignorance, you know, let's look at it. It breeds fear. Ignorance can breed fear. Even, let's go to church for a moment. The Apostle Paul, in his letters to the churches in Rome, Corinth, and Thessalonica, he often exclaimed about 5 or 6 times in these letters, some of these letters, that he would not have the people who were reading the letter to be ignorant. He said, I would not have you to be ignorant, brother, concerning this, that, or another thing, whatever he was addressing. I do not want you not to know or not to understand where I'm coming from with something. Because this situation, whatever it was he was talking about, was so important, I do not want you to be afraid for lack of knowledge. I do not want you to fall prey to the device for lack of knowledge of what you're up against, right? So, what kind of things do we lack knowledge about? What are we afraid of? The dark. The dark. Simple, right? And you may say, well, I'm grown up now, I'm an adult, I have nothing to fear in the dark. Well, just stub your toe in the dark. Stub that little toe in the dark. I guarantee you'll go and find you some light tomorrow. Because you don't want that to happen again. I often say in my dissertations, if you will, my messages, that we are all one body. We're all important. The church, the body of Christ, we as humans, we are all connected. We are all important. And I said, if you don't believe me, stub your little toe. Everything about you will stop to see about that little toe. All right? Both of your hands will go to grabbing it. Everything stops. And so we are all connected. An unfamiliar place. We got lost. I was with my mother and father. I was maybe 12, 13, so several years ago. We were on our way to Chicago to visit some family for the first time. Never been to Chicago, and I believe Cabrini Greens was still up at the time. And so my mother and father, they got turned around, and we got there late at night, and so and it was hot. It was hot outside. So that's an X factor, the heat, right?
Yeah.
And so we get to an area, I remember vividly because people started talking out, hey, what are you doing with that nice car? Hey, what you doing around here? You don't belong around. Started throwing rocks at us, right? We got scared. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know which way to turn to get out of there. Fear came upon us because we did not know where we were. An unfamiliar place. Snakes. Creatures that we don't understand necessarily. Those things, when we see them, maybe we see them on TV, oh, that's cool, that's neat, that's nifty. You see one in your house, though. Or a mouse. Even a mouse. They're maybe relatively harmless creatures. But how many 300-pound fellas will jump up on a chair? I'm not 300 pounds, but I'll jump. Close. Right? We get scared of things that we do not understand. People who do not look like us, speak like us, or worship like us, live like us, eat the same foods we do, or as we're eating, do the same things. There are cultures that don't use utensils, they just use their fingers.
Yeah.
Cultures that don't sit in a chair, they sit on the floor. Cultures that wear different types of clothing. And because we don't understand it, we may fear it. And our fear can turn into aggression, ignorance. I'm almost finished. Zoot Suit riots, June 3rd through the 8th, 1943, Los Angeles, California, where Mexican Americans were targeted and beaten. Some of them were slain, I believe. Emmett Till, Rosewood, Florida. Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. I believe they say that is the first time that bombs fell from planes to American soil. And it was done in aggression to an African American community. A well-to-do community in 1921. It's called Black Wall Street. African Americans own their own businesses, their own banks, their own homes. Very affluent. But some people, I guess, for whatever the spark was that started that aggression for 2 to 3 days, someone didn't like or didn't understand what they saw. Chinese massacre of 1871, where Chinese were systematically lynched in Los Angeles, California. The Executive Order 9066 came forth in 1942 and went on through 1945, where Japanese Americans were rounded up and placed in internment camps after we were bombed at Pearl Harbor. An executive order came down from a beloved president, but for ignorance, not knowing, simply not knowing. This is not, I'm not coming at people hard and saying that they're stupid or they're mean I'm saying they simply do not know. Simply do not know. Viola Liuzzo, 39-year-old woman from Detroit, Michigan, mother of 5, happened to be a white lady, shot to death in Selma, Alabama, for trying to help African Americans to register to vote. And when I look at this, and Dr. Mazzocco talked about racism, and yes, there were the images that we saw when we think of racism tend to be white on black, if you will. But there are many episodes. There are some black on white racisms because we don't understand. I submit to you that these things and other instances happened to different people at different points in time because we as a whole find it hard to understand one another. And we are ignorant to one another. I also submit to you that I think it would take the courage of a physician, of a doctor who goes to a foreign country, into the jungle, to learn about a creature that they previously don't know about. It would take some courage like that for even us to learn about one another. And when we can learn about one another, when we can understand one another, we can dispel fear. Thank you.